A group of scientists wanted to reach the world's highest altitude and break a record, but after getting badly trapped, they realized there was no chance of coming down. This adventurous story begins in a small town in London during the 19th century. Among a crowd of people, we are introduced to a brave and beautiful woman named Amy, who was often haunted by strange visions. Years earlier, her husband had died in an accident involving a hot air balloon that had carried him too high, and after falling from that height, survival was impossible. Since then, Amy had been unable to sleep peacefully, constantly haunted by the memory. Her friend warned her that it wasn't the right time to take risks, but Amy was stubborn. If she wanted something, she would do it no matter what. Soon it became clear that Amy was preparing for another hot air balloon journey, determined to face her fears and imagination head-on. What she didn't know was that she would soon find herself so isolated that no one could come to her rescue. In the center of the town, a grand show was being held where James, a scientist, was preparing his balloon. His goal was to ascend higher than anyone ever had before and break the existing world record, claiming a new title for himself. Huge crowds had gathered to witness the event, treating it like a festival, since at that time hot air balloons were seen as the pinnacle of flight technology. James carefully inspected the balloon, making sure everything was ready before takeoff. A friend approached him, warning that the weather conditions were unstable and this was not the right moment to attempt such a risky ascent. But James dismissed his concerns, boasting about his knowledge and survival experience in harsher conditions. Their discussion was interrupted by a businessman, the owner of the balloon and the sponsor of the show, who insisted the event could not be cancelled because he had invested a lot of money. He pressured James to continue, and James agreed, supporting him while completely ignoring his friend's warnings. Soon Amy appeared at the event, dazzling the crowd with her acrobatics and charm, lifting everyone's spirits. Her presence was both entertaining and inspiring, and James was delighted to have her as his partner for the journey. Together, they made a strong team, James with his scientific expertise, and Amy as a skilled balloon pilot. Their mission was to reach record-breaking heights and write their names in history. Amy even brought along her small dog, despite James's objections that it might become a danger later. She refused to listen and boarded the balloon with the animal. Within moments, the balloon began its ascent, and the cheering crowd erupted with excitement, wishing them success in their daring attempt to break the world record. As the hot air balloon kept rising higher, Amy suddenly noticed a man among the crowd below. He looked strangely familiar, but she brushed it off and focused on entertaining the audience. Hanging from the ropes and performing daring stunts in midair, she didn't miss a single chance to impress the cheering spectators. Their journey had officially begun, aiming to break the world record. Amy and James sat in the basket as the balloon soared upward while the crowd below roared with excitement, knowing that if the record was broken, their town's name would shine in history. James stayed busy with his scientific instruments when Amy suddenly asked him to hand her the dog. Confused about why she would want the dog at such a height, he hesitated, warning it could be risky. But Amy insisted until James finally gave in. To his shock, Amy tossed the dog out of the balloon. The crowd gasped in horror, certain the animal would die, but within moments, a parachute attached to the dog opened, and it floated safely downward. The audience erupted in amazement, thrilled by Amy's daring stunt. James, too, realized that Amy was far more creative than he had expected, and she clearly understood the importance of putting on a show, especially since the businessman sponsoring them had invested heavily. Their real journey began from there as the balloon climbed higher. Within minutes, they reached several thousand feet, the normal altitude where most balloons flew. But their mission was to go far higher, to an altitude where breathing itself became difficult. Once they achieved their world record, they would attempt to descend. James, gazing down from that height, was lost in the breathtaking view. It was his first real ascent this high, and he felt exhilarated. Amy reminded him that while he was enjoying the scenery, her role was to keep the audience entertained and emotionally connected to their adventure, something she had been doing from the very beginning. James agreed, recognizing that the crowd's excitement was largely thanks to Amy, but he chose not to argue, immersing himself instead in the beauty around him. For James, this was more than just a flight, it was the realization of a lifelong dream. Since childhood, he had wanted to become an aeronaut, someone who explored the skies and studied strange phenomena at extreme altitudes. Looking down, he spotted his old university, the very place where he had studied with his best friend and first dreamed of breaking records. He remembered watching a proud scientist through a telescope back then, the man who had once held the record for the highest balloon flight. James had promised himself he would one day surpass him. After years of hard study and research, today was that day. With Amy's skill as a pilot, James believed their mission would remain safe. But soon, they were about to face a truth no explorer before them had ever encountered. James announced that he was preparing for a mission to break the record for the highest altitude ever reached, and along the way he hoped to make a groundbreaking discovery about weather patterns. Everyone listened closely as he explained his research. According to his studies, once they reached extreme heights, they could gather enough information to predict future weather conditions and changes. In a way, it was the earliest concept of weather forecasting, since no device at the time could predict the climate ahead. James presented his theory with confidence, determined to prove it, but many senior aeronauts dismissed his ideas as foolish and senseless. No one supported him, and James felt disheartened. Still, he vowed to complete his research no matter what. That brings us back to the present, where James and Amy had already ascended to incredible heights. Using his instruments, James carefully recorded weather data and sent updates back to his laboratory with the help of carrier pigeons, determined to make his research a success. Amy focused on controlling the balloon and steering it in the right direction, while James continued his measurements. But suddenly, the balloon picked up alarming speed. The weather had turned against them. Heavy rain and violent winds began thrashing them from all sides. The gusts were so strong that Amy lost almost all control of the balloon, and objects inside the basket were flying everywhere. Even Amy and James nearly tumbled out. Amy fought desperately to steady them, but the storm above was so powerful that escaping it seemed impossible. Equipment was scattered, and in the chaos James struck his head, collapsing unconscious. Amy, barely hanging on, nearly slipped out of the basket but managed to grab a rope. Lightning flashed violently across the sky, and one strike dangerously close to the balloon threatened to ignite it and kill them both. Just in time, James regained consciousness and grabbed Amy's hand, pulling her to safety. The two of them huddled in a corner of the basket as rain poured mercilessly. The situation grew even more dangerous. If water continued to fill the balloon's basket, its weight would drag them fatally down. Their only option was counterintuitive but clear. Instead of descending, they had to rise even higher, above the storm clouds. As James knew, clouds only extend to a certain level of Earth's atmosphere. Beyond that is clear sky, and eventually, the edge of space itself. Normally, airplanes flew below storm clouds, not above them, but in this desperate moment James realized that the safest path was upward. He quickly ordered Amy to release the sandbags to make the balloon lighter. Working together, they threw them overboard, and the balloon began to rise sharply. Slowly but surely, they ascended above the raging storm. What they saw when they emerged took their breath away, an otherworldly view they could never have imagined. They were soaring in pure freedom, surrounded only by endless clouds below and golden sunlight above. It felt as though they had entered a hidden world, one that didn't even exist on Earth. James and Amy were overwhelmed by the breathtaking view, convinced they would never experience such a place again. After escaping the storm, they checked their equipment and, using their combined knowledge, pushed forward toward their ultimate goal. They still had to climb higher to break the world record, to altitudes where breathing itself became difficult, and where the real danger awaited them. For now, they were savoring the moment. James shouted into the vast silence, releasing his frustrations at the world below, knowing no one could hear him up there. Surrounded by endless clouds and open skies, Amy joined in, shouting too, and both of them felt a deep sense of relief. Soon after, a swarm of butterflies drifted past them in midair, a sight so stunning it left them speechless. Seeing such beauty in the open sky was beyond imagination. Feeling comfortable with James for the first time, Amy began to open up about her past. She confessed that she was still haunted by visions of her late husband, who had died on a similar mission, falling to his death from great height. His tragic end had scarred her, and she often found herself lost in those memories. Her mind drifted back to months earlier, before this mission, when she had attended a party with a friend. There she met James, who already knew of her skills as a brilliant pilot. He shared his ambition of becoming a renowned aeronaut and breaking the altitude record, but admitted he could not do it without her. Amy hesitated, thinking of the money and the recognition, and finally agreed to help. Now, in the present, as they neared record-breaking height, Amy found herself opening up to James more than she had with anyone else, sharing her husband's story in detail. James was the first person she had ever trusted enough to talk to about it. But as they watched the butterflies disappear into the distance, Amy slipped into a darker state of mind, tormented again by disturbing visions. She recalled a time when she had outright told James she could not go through with the mission, that she had no strength left after her husband's painful death. James had been devastated, especially after preparing so extensively, but he refused to give up. He had even gone to a senior aeronaut for help, only to be dismissed. The man mocked him, saying James would never survive that altitude and clearly did not want his own record broken. But James's determination never wavered. Back in the present, James and Amy finally achieved what they had been fighting for all along. They crossed the world record altitude. It was the most triumphant moment of their lives, the culmination of years of preparation. James immediately documented the achievement and sent the details to his colleagues, ensuring proof that together they had made history. Both of their faces were glowing with happiness as they kept moving forward, but suddenly Amy began to feel the air growing colder and the temperature dropping rapidly. She immediately told James that they should start heading down, but James insisted that if they went higher, they could set a new world record that no one would be able to break for years. Amy grew frustrated with him, reminding him that their lives were at risk, but James managed to convince her to climb a little higher. Whether they would make it back alive or not was something they would experience soon enough. Earlier, when Amy had refused to go with James, his close friend had approached her and pleaded that she join James on this mission. He explained that breaking the world record had always been James's dream and that he wanted to become a great aeronaut. To protect that dream, Amy needed to help him. In fact, James's friend begged her to do whatever it took to make James's dream come true. Amy thought deeply about it and grew emotional, because her late husband once had the same dream, to reach the highest altitude and set a world record. Sadly, her husband never managed to achieve it. After a long time, Amy finally decided to support James and help him complete his mission. That was why she was with him now, and together they had already broken the record. According to the plan, they should have started descending, but James wanted to go even higher so that his record would remain unchallenged forever. Amy noticed, however, that at this altitude the oxygen level had dropped drastically, and the cold had become so extreme that ice was forming on their bodies. She kept urging James to descend, warning him that at this height they could freeze to death, and if they fell, survival would be impossible. But James wanted to push further, so he began throwing more weight out of the balloon to make it rise faster. Amy tried to stop him, but James seemed to have lost his senses. The oxygen level had dropped to a dangerously low point, but Amy refused to let them die this way. Determined to save them, she risked her own life and began climbing up the side of the massive balloon. The ropes were coated with thick ice, and her hands were weak and trembling from exhaustion, yet she did not stop. With sheer determination, she pulled herself upward until she finally reached the very top. There, she struck the frozen center panel again and again, shattering away layers of ice until she could gain control of the ropes and stabilize the balloon. Though she succeeded, the effort drained every bit of her strength, and she collapsed unconscious right there. For several minutes she lay motionless, but then her body began slipping. Suddenly, she was falling from that terrifying height. Desperately, she tried to grab the ropes of the balloon, but the ice made them too slick to hold on to, and she continued plummeting downward. Just when it seemed certain she would fall to her death, it was revealed that, in her last desperate effort, she had tied herself to one of the ropes. She now dangled thousands of feet in the air, swinging helplessly beneath the balloon. Gathering what little strength she had left, Amy managed to swing herself close enough to catch the edge of the basket and finally pull herself back inside. There, she found James lying unconscious, completely unresponsive. Panicked but determined, Amy pressed herself close to him, wrapping her arms around his cold body to share her warmth. After a tense few moments, James gasped and opened his eyes. Amy had already lost her husband in a tragedy like this, and she refused to allow James, who had so quickly become important to her, to die the same way. Meanwhile, because Amy had loosened the ropes at the top, the balloon had begun to descend steadily, lowering them to a safer altitude. They were now less than a few thousand feet above the ground, and for a brief moment, they both believed they might survive this ordeal. But just as they reached that height, disaster struck once again. The ropes of their basket began snapping apart under the strain. The balloon lurched violently, and within seconds they were plummeting downward at terrifying speed. The impact waiting below would surely kill them both. James quickly realized what was happening, and with no time to waste, he shouted to Amy that they had to move to another level. His plan was desperate but simple. If they abandoned the basket and lightened the load, the balloon's speed might decrease. Without hesitation, both of them began climbing upward along the frozen ropes. The ropes were wet, slick, and freezing cold, making it nearly impossible to keep their grip, but they forced themselves upward through sheer willpower. Amy's arms burned with pain, and James's hands were bleeding from the cuts of the rope, yet neither stopped. Finally, James reached the connection point and, using every ounce of strength, cut the basket free. For a moment, they both believed this act would save their lives. But to their horror, the opposite happened. The moment the basket detached, the balloon lost its stabilizing weight. Instead of slowing, it began plunging downward at double the speed. The air roared around them as the world below rushed closer, certain to end their lives in a violent crash. Amy's heart sank. She knew the science behind it. Without the basket's counterweight, the balloon was nothing but a useless shell. At this speed, no one could survive. Realizing this, Amy made the most painful decision of her life. Her eyes filled with tears as she thought of her late husband. She could not allow James to meet the same fate. Whispering a trembling goodbye under her breath, she prepared to sacrifice herself, planning to jump off and at least give James a chance to hold on. But before she could let go, James grabbed her wrist with all his strength. His voice, though weak, was steady. "Not this time, Amy. We both survive, or neither of us does." In that desperate moment, James's mind sparked with one last daring idea. Instead of giving up, he would transform the balloon itself into a giant parachute. Acting fast, he began knotting ropes together, tying sections of the balloon's fabric to create drag. Then, with a pocket knife, he carefully slashed open the lower seams of the balloon, letting controlled bursts of air escape. The balloon buckled, stretched, and began catching the air in a new way. Slowly, unbelievably, their deadly freefall transformed into a glide. The balloon had become a massive parachute. The speed stabilized. The violent roar softened. For the first time in hours, Amy felt hope return. They were still descending fast, but no longer at a speed that guaranteed death. Through the thick clouds, they could see the vast expanse of green below, a forest. Their hearts pounded as the ground came closer and closer until, finally, with bone-rattling force, they crashed through the treetops. Branches snapped, wood splintered, and both of them were thrown hard against the tangled ropes. Pain seared through their bodies, scratches and bruises covering them, but when the world finally stilled, they were alive. Breathing heavily, Amy looked at James, and for the first time since the nightmare began, they both laughed, weak, broken laughter, but filled with relief. Against all odds, they had survived. Days later, James stood before his superiors, presenting his research and recounting their impossible survival. The room was silent in awe. What they had accomplished was not just science, it was history. James and Amy's names were etched into the record books, hailed as pioneers who broke the impossible barrier and lived to tell the tale. And in the final scene, we see James and Amy once again preparing for another daring expedition. This time, side by side, stronger than ever, with unshakable trust forged in the skies. Their story wasn't ending here, it was only the beginning.